Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Have you ever made a big decision and wondered if you were listening to the right information? Today we are diving into a super interesting study that explores exactly that. It asks, when we're trying to figure things out from investing money to choosing a doctor and even hiring someone, which kind of information do we trust more? The opinions of other people, or hard facts from experiments and real observations? This paper is all about how we weigh evidence. Think about it. We're constantly bombarded with information. Some of it comes from what other people believe, and some of it comes from actual data, like scientific studies or historical outcomes. This research wanted to see which one makes a bigger splash in our brains when we're making choices. The authors point out that making good decisions is super important in all parts of life. It can mean the difference between success and failure, or even life and death. So understanding how we process information is a big deal for scientists. They are really curious about what kind of information is most influential and for whom it is most influential. Basically, the big takeaway from this paper is that people generally trust facts and real-world data more than they trust what other people believe. Across the board, in investing, hiring, and health decisions, the evidence that came from experiments and observed outcomes was almost twice as strong as evidence based on what large groups of people thought. This is a pretty consistent finding across all their studies. They explain that evidence is just facts used to back up beliefs and decisions, and statistical evidence, numbers that summarize observations, is really persuasive, but they focus on two types. You've got social statistical evidence, which is based on what other people believe or do, like saying Differential of people believe climate change is a threat. Then there is empirical statistical evidence, which comes from actual experiments and observed data, like saying, emissions have caused over 1 trillion in global economic damage. This is where they really wanted to nail down which type of evidence packs a bigger punch. They noticed that previous studies hadn't directly compared them in a fair way. So this team came up with a clever way to present both types of evidence using the exact same format and scales, so they could directly see the effects. They hypothesized that empirical evidence, the facts and outcomes, would be more influential because sometimes what everyone believes isn't actually the truth. This is the other big question: does who you are, like what you tend to believe, change how you react to evidence? They looked at two key traits. First, conspiracist ideation, which is basically a tendency to believe in conspiracy theories. They thought people high in this might not be as good at using factual evidence. Second, analytical thinking. This is about using logic and careful reasoning. They figured people who are good analytical thinkers would be more likely to trust the factual evidence. To answer these questions, they ran 5 studies. Study 1 looked at investing, Study 2 at health decisions, and Study 3 at hiring. Then Studies 4 and 5 added a new type of information, AI-generated stuff. They even measured everyone's tendency to believe in conspiracies and how analytical they were. So, Study 1 was all about investing. Imagine you are looking at a stock. Would you be more likely to buy it if lots of people said it was going to go up, or if historical data showed it usually went up in similar situations? They wanted to know. They hypothesized that the historical data, the empirical evidence, would matter more. They showed participants mock screenshots from a stock trading app. Each screenshot had info about a fictitious stock. Crucially, each one had 2 pieces of information. One about what percentage of app users thought the stock would go up, social evidence, and another about what percentage of the time similar stocks went up in the past, empirical evidence. Both were presented as percentages from 0 to 100%. This way, they could directly compare how much each piece of info swayed participants. They asked people how much they believed the stock would increase in value. They asked how valuable they thought the stock was. And finally, if they would buy the stock, they used the scale to measure how much people tended to believe in conspiracy theories. And they used a test called the cognitive reflection test, which is good at spotting people who think things through logically instead of just going with their gut feeling. And here is what they found in the investing study. Both types of evidence had an effect, but empirical statistical evidence, the facts about past performance, had a much bigger impact. For every 10% increase in that good solid data, belief in the stock went up more, and the chances of buying it increased way more compared to when the social evidence was higher. They figured out that empirical evidence was about 1.7 to 1.8 times more influential than social evidence for their beliefs and decisions. Now, for the individual differences, they found that people who scored high on conspiracist ideation were less likely to be swayed by the empirical evidence when it came to their beliefs and decisions. But get this, they were more likely to consider the social evidence. The opposite was true for people who were high in analytical thinking. They were more swayed by the empirical evidence and less by the social evidence. So, study 1 clearly showed that factual evidence matters more for decisions, especially in a non-social context like investing. And it confirmed that if you tend to believe in conspiracies, you are less likely to trust the facts. But the question remained, would this hold true in other areas like health? Study 2 took this to a health context. Imagine deciding whether to take a prescription drug. Would you be more influenced by knowing what percentage of people believe it is effective, or by knowing what percentage of clinical trials found it effective? They hypothesized, just like before, that the clinical trial data, the empirical evidence, would be more convincing. They used a similar design to study 1, but this time it was about fictitious prescription drugs. Instead of stock apps, they showed screenshots from an app with drug information. One piece of info was about what percentage of users believed the drug was effective, social evidence. And the other was about what percentage of clinical trials supported its efficacy, empirical evidence. Here they added a fourth outcome, predictions about how the drug might perform in future studies. So they measured specific beliefs, general attitudes, decisions to take the drug, and predictions about its future effectiveness. The results were very similar. Both social and empirical evidence influenced people's beliefs, attitudes, decisions, and predictions. But again, empirical statistical evidence was about 1.5 to 2 times more influential than social statistical evidence. So even when it came to health, facts generally trumped opinions, and the individual differences story repeated itself. People high in conspiracist ideation were more influenced by social evidence and less by empirical evidence. Analytical thinkers, on the other hand, showed more receptiveness to the empirical evidence. Study 2 confirmed the findings from Study 1 in a health context. Empirical evidence was generally more persuasive, and individual differences, like conspiracist ideation, played a role in how evidence was weighted. However, they noted that the context was still pretty asocial. What about situations where social information might be more important? Like hiring someone. That was the focus of Study 3. Looking at hiring decisions, they presented participants with information about fictitious college admissions coaches. They were given data on what percentage of people believed the coach was effective. Social evidence versus what percentage of students tutored by that coach got into their top choice university, empirical evidence. Again, they hypothesized that the actual outcome data would be more persuasive. The setup was like the previous studies, but with college admissions coaches. The social evidence was about user belief, and the empirical evidence was about student admission success rates. And guess what? The pattern held strong. Empirical statistical evidence was considerably more impactful than social statistical evidence, about twice as influential in this hiring context. It seems facts and outcomes are consistently more persuasive across different domains. For the individual differences, conspiracist ideation again showed less receptiveness to empirical evidence, while analytical thinking showed more. Interestingly, in this hiring context, the moderation by analytical thinking wasn't as strong as in the previous studies, but the pattern with conspiracist ideation remained consistent, less trust, in fact. So, after 3 studies, the message was clear. Empirical evidence generally wins over social evidence, and personal beliefs about conspiracies and analytical skills shape how we react. But now, there is this new kid on the block. AI-generated information. How does that fit in? Studies 4 and 5 introduced AI-generated information. In Study 4, they looked at health decisions again, but this time they compared social evidence, empirical evidence, and now AI-generated information. They wanted to see how these 3 competed. They modified the prescription drug task to include a third piece of information, a summary generated by an AI about the drug's efficacy. This time, they had social evidence, empirical evidence, and AI-generated information all presented together. This is where it gets really interesting. In Study 4, they found that both social and empirical evidence were much more impactful than the AI-generated information. In fact, social evidence outperformed empirical evidence in this particular study. This was a surprise. The individual difference effects continued to show that conspiracist ideation was linked to less reliance on empirical evidence, while analytical thinking was linked to more. The authors were a bit puzzled by the flip in Study 4, where social evidence seemed stronger than empirical. They realized the wording they used for the social and empirical evidence might have accidentally made the social evidence sound more like factual data. So, they designed Study 5 to sort this out. Study 5 came in 2 parts, 5A and 5B. The goal was to check if the wording change in Study 4 was the real reason social evidence seemed more potent, or if it was the presence of AI information. In 5A, they return to the original wording of social and empirical evidence, like in studies 1 to 3, and presented them without AI info. In 5B, they used the same original wording but included the AI info. They essentially ran two versions of the health task, ensuring the social and empirical evidence descriptions were clear and consistent with earlier studies. Study 5A had just the two, and Study 5B had all three: social, empirical, and AI. And the results confirmed their suspicion. In both Study 5A and 5B, empirical statistical evidence was significantly more influential than social statistical evidence, just like in the first three studies. This means the wording was the issue in Study 4, not the AI itself. Importantly, in both studies, empirical and social evidence were still much more persuasive than the AI. Generated information. The patterns for conspiracist ideation and analytical thinking mostly held up in Study 5, showing that these personal traits continue to influence how we process social versus empirical evidence. Interestingly, when AI-generated information was present in Study 5B, it actually seemed to slightly decrease the impact of both social and empirical evidence. This suggests that adding more information, even AI-generated, might distract us and make us less responsive to the more important types of evidence. So let's wrap this all up. The main goal was to see how social and empirical evidence stack up, and how our own minds might change that. Across 5 studies and thousands of participants, the message is loud and clear. People are consistently about twice as responsive to empirical statistical evidence, the facts and outcomes, compared to social statistical evidence, the beliefs of others. This is true across investing, health, and hiring. And our personalities definitely matter. People who lean towards believing in conspiracies are less likely to trust factual, empirical evidence. This might be a key reason why misinformation spreads. People who are already prone to conspiracy thinking aren't as swayed by scientific facts. On the flip side, those who are strong analytical thinkers are more likely to lean on empirical evidence. Now, no study is perfect, and the researchers were upfront about that. They mentioned that future research could look at not just the type of evidence, but also who the evidence comes from. For example, does social evidence matter more if it comes from someone you like or agree with? And does empirical evidence from a super trustworthy source hold more weight? They also suggest looking at different cultures and how they might weigh evidence differently. So, what does this all mean for us? It really emphasizes the power of factual evidence. When you are trying to make an important decision, looking at solid data and outcomes, rather than just what seems popular or what people are saying, is generally a more reliable path. This research helps us understand why we might be persuaded by one thing and not another, and it highlights how our own internal wiring can influence that process. It is a call to be more critical consumers of information, to seek out the empirical data when possible, and to be aware of how our own predispositions might be shaping our beliefs. Thanks for joining me today on RUBIN'S Mind Lab. If you found this interesting, please give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment with your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more dives into the fascinating world of psychology and what makes us tick. See you next time.